I used to work at Experian back in the 90s, and I did mergers and acquisitions work. I was a corp dev guy, did strategic alliances. And me and two other guys came up with this idea for a product that Experian should do. And we were like, hey, if we take application data from across the country, no matter what the type of application is, it could be for opening a checking account or getting your wireless phone or a credit card, and just look at the identity data, we might have a good way of trying to detect manipulations in the identity data and detect potential identity fraud. So we pitched that within Experian, and we got shot down. And they said, hey, we already got lots of identity data coming in. We don't need to spread out and get more of it because we got plenty. So it's a waste of time. So me and these two guys got really pissed off. I mean, like literally, we left the room. We're like, these guys don't know squat. We went to Wolfgang Puck's, sat there, and had some beers and just venting to each other. And while we were venting, I pulled out a napkin, literally a napkin and a pen, and I said, you know, if I were going to design this outside of Experian, this is exactly what I would do. And I started drawing it all out on this napkin. And this other guy across from me goes, I think we can build that. And I was like, yeah? And he's like, let's build a business plan this weekend. So we had our whiteboards up, and we're drawing everything out, and we literally came up with this business plan in about 48 hours. Spreadsheets, figuring out revenue potential, and we had, you know, you're in the kind of that hyper moment of, okay, we got to name the company, and it's going to be big, and it's going to be huge, and what are we going to name it? This is in 1999, and in 1999, everything was like this or that, and so, you know, we're like, well, if it's going to be ID fraud, it's got to have like a watchdog, yeah, you know, and it's going to be like this really ferocious dog, and it's going to guard consumers' data, and this is going to be huge. And so we went like, well, it can't just be dog, it's got to be iDog, because, you know. So then IDOG was taken because of the Cleveland Browns fans there was like the dog pound, and they took over iDog for whatever reason. So it was a bunch of Cleveland Brown fans, IDOG, and then we went, we're going to be irreverent. We're going DAWG. And so we named the company iDog because we could get the URL. So later there was some common sense prevailed, and it became ID Analytics, and the company did do well. It got bought for $185 million when it sold to LifeLock. And that's a whole nother story I could tell you someday. But we're going to talk about Experian DataLabs, and knowing that most of you guys are into startups, I think you're going to enjoy this. And you might enjoy it more if you wind up going to a big company and you still have a startup bug. So I'm going to talk about how I came up with the idea and kind of the journey that we've gone through, where we're at today. We'll talk about some of those success stories, and we'll just get into Q&A. And I try to use as much time as we can for Q&A because I think that's the most fun anyway for all of us. Okay, when you're running a P&L, you've got a lot of pressure for revenue and earnings. And so you've got a little bit of investment capital that you can use to place your bets. What am I going to invest in that's going to drive revenue and earnings? Now, some of us might have the luxury of investing long term, but generally, because of that pressure, you're going to invest on things that are going to generate revenue as fast as possible. And so with Experian and my P&L, one of my challenges was most of my investment capital got squirreled away for things that I had to do. The government came in and said, you're under consent decree and you have to change your reports and it's got to look like this. So there goes a bunch of my money. Then I've got some of my biggest clients and they say, hey, if you build this, we'll go ahead and we'll pay you. And in fact, we're going to give you an idea of how much value there is and how much we're going to pay you. And so we'll go, if I build this, I'm going to get $5 or $10 million in revenue. I'm going to do that, that's certain. And so what I wound up having left with was next to nothing on anything that required a risk and anything that was long term. And after I did that for a couple of years, I got super frustrated. I came into Experian as a startup guy. They hired me to drive product innovation, and they said, hey, we're going to give you a big needle, and your job is to move it even more. I got excited about that. I was like, I'm going to run this big P&L, I'm going to move this needle, and it's going to be great. After a couple of years, I got really frustrated. And so I went to my boss, and I started telling him this story, and he said, there's nothing I can do about it. You're going to need to go to my boss. And his boss at the time was a group president named Kerry Williams. If you look us up on publicly, he's on our board of directors, and he's now our global chief operating officer. But I went into his office with 5 PowerPoint slides. And 4 of them, the 5th one had the financials. 4 of them are pretty much these 4 points right here. The first one was about the nature of product and P&Ls, which is what I just shared with you. The second one started to get into my pitch of what are we going to do about it? So, the investment capital is tied up for a P&L. What if we created an environment where there was no P&L, that we could leverage the competencies across the enterprise? I mean, we were a business sitting on top of lots of data, lots of software tools, great distribution, great client lists, easy to find partners. I mean, when you work at Experian, I would tell you, you can call pretty much any company in the world, and you're going to get a meeting with them. It's easy. Because they're like, hey, it's Experian. Sure, we'll talk with you. You guys have a lot of interesting things going on. So we have the competencies. And all I was thinking is, if we can make a small bet without that expectation and let it take the risk, let this bet take the risk, that the yield potential could be pretty significant. As long as we give it enough time. Everything takes time. And in this world, if we're going to take the risk, we need time. So before I even got to the third part about the bet, I just talked about my problem with the P&L, and then my idea about leveraging competencies. The second slide, Kerry cut me off. And he said, I already know what you want to do. I think it's a great idea. He said, I've been wanting to do it for years, but I've never really had anybody step up. And so he's like, I'll get you the money. Can you get the kinds of people that you need to innovate? And I was a startup guy, so I said, yeah, sure. I know I got a laundry list of people. I was like, if you give me the money to work with, I can get the right kinds of people. So he's like, okay, this is what we're going to do. So we went to his country club. There should be a flag right there, right? The guy's got his own country club. We go in, and he invites all the BU presidents in. And if any of you guys are wine drinkers, he brought in a half case of Camus, the private select, which is about $200 a bottle. And we just started having some nice wine. And then the courses started to come, and by the time we get to dessert, everyone's feeling really good. And he's like, Eric's got a story to tell you. So I told him my story, and then he went around the room and said, what do you guys think? Is it a good idea? And I said, yeah, this is a great idea. We got to do it. He's like, great. You're each going to pay $500,000 into this pool, and he's going to use all your cash, and he's going to go build the first lab. And literally after the first week, that happened like on a Tuesday or Wednesday night. Literally the following Monday, I had my budget and I was already hiring my first person, which was a global chief scientist. So that's the cool thing at Experian. They let you be an entrepreneur. I guess that's the term intrapreneur, but definitely that's how it started. So it started small. It started very small. I actually felt it was too small. If you are like me, you pretty much get annoyed with just about all these kinds of things because you're like, if you gave me twice as many people, I can move faster. If you gave me more money, I could get more things done. And so they gave me a small team, 8 people. I could choose who I wanted to hire, how I wanted the mix to be. So my assertion was, I want people who can build things. So I'm a creative guy. I can think of good ideas. I can work with clients. So I know what I'm good at, but I can't build. My coding days are way behind me. So I need people who can build, and I want the smartest people I can find. So those of you who want to start a business, not a bad model, not a bad idea, find the smartest people you can find. And I did. The first guy I hired was now our global chief scientist. He's a former Los Alamos Labs scientist. His PhD's from Columbia, undergrad and graduate school at Peking University in China. When John Reed invested outside of Citibank, former board chairman of Citibank, if you remember, I think he takes credit for coming up with the ATM, if you read Wiki or whatever. But he invested in a group of Los Alamos scientists, and this guy, Shanji Zhang, was one of those scientists. When you walked into Chase or Citi or any major bank in the United States, they know Shanji. He's like famous. He's the first guy I hired. As soon as I hired him, I got 4 other scientists like that. And they just couldn't wait to follow him because he said this is what he wanted to do. What was my pitch? Just what I just told you guys. Got all this data, untapped. We're stuck in our own P&Ls. We're not taking advantage of these things. Tons of opportunity. We're going to start this thing up from scratch. He was all in. We had to build our own computational environment. We're going to be building these things that will require a lot of data. This was 7 years ago. Experian, believe it or not, really wasn't used to that. All of our systems were great to drive the P&Ls. If you're in a credit bureau, the systems we had in place, we run credit reports, collect data perfectly. You want to do anything experimental? Not really an environment for that. So we had to go and architect our own environment, bring in our own servers, bring in our own storage, create our own relationships in IT. All that takes time in a big company. We had one of the top 3 payment brands in the world give us 3 years of all their data. And that happened about 6 weeks after we opened the lab. We're talking, gosh, I want to say it was about 15 billion transactions. So we were under a lot of pressure to create that computational environment really fast. I mean, we're making phone calls and getting the IT, got to get those boxes in, created a Hadoop environment. We're like, we're driving fast because that data was coming in, and we had no choice. But our first product we got out in about 3 months' time. Our second product we got out in about 6 months' time, and we were starting to roll. And that's what I want to say is, if you've worked in a big company, sometimes when you start up something new, one of the hardest parts is getting everybody else to give you the support you need. And I've worked for a few big companies, Visa, MasterCard, and Experian. And that support comes in the notion of, gee, if I'm going to put time into this new lab, that means I'm taking time away from something else I'm doing. I'm not getting paid to do that. It's not in my objectives. I'm not going to get an extra bonus for doing this. So I kind of have to buy into the idea that I'm doing something good for Experian. I'm doing something that is pushing us forward. And maybe that'll come back to me in some way, but maybe it won't. So I have to just buy into supporting it. You do something new in a big company, that is hard to get. You really, if you're studying anything around being political savviness, being able to understand who your supporters and detractors are in an organization, how are you going to turn around those opinions, critical, absolutely critical in an environment like this. You have to be able to do that. We're working really fast. One of the biggest things that we could do to gain support with client wins, because our company is designed, Brittany's nodding her head because she knows, designed around client wins. When a client wants something and they're willing to pay for it, or they just even say, hey, I bring in $20 million of revenue to Experian and I find this very interesting, the company responds in a significant way. So that's where we were focused. We're like, you know what? We'll go forge our own relationships. I hired some guys that already knew executives in these top accounts that we wouldn't normally talk to. And we started building those relationships and getting those deals, and that changed a lot within the company. So that was basically how we started. This next thing, I think if I hit the next button, it's going to play a video. This video was done about a year ago. So it's a little dated, but I thought it'd kind of give you an idea what happened since then up to about a year ago. So I drink my own Kool-Aid because I still get a lump in my throat every time I see that video. It's kind of, I know it's boring for you. It's really exciting for me. Only because I'll tell you, when you start up something and you see it blossom, it's just, you can't describe the feeling. It's like, we work for money. We work to get paid. But when you work and you get excited about something, then it's not work, it's your life. And so a lot of those things, we have a great PR team, obviously. But what came out of this, beyond the products and the revenues, which we'll talk a bit about, was all of a sudden now we're pushing thought leadership for the company. We're pushing thought leadership with our clients, with our partners, because this idea of taking, we'll say, nascent assets, latent opportunity and turning it into something, everybody wants to do that. You can be Verizon, you could be Walmart, you can be Citibank, doesn't matter the industry. They all want to try to do something similar. And so as a company that has all of them as clients, first thing they want to do is meet with the guys that started to do it. And they go, how'd you pull it off? How are you doing it now? How can we work together? Can we work together? I was just sharing with a group of folks the lab that we opened in Sao Paulo, which if you go online, you'll see, I love to promote these things. So you see, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see I have lots of videos and things about what we're doing in Sao Paulo. But banks are paying us literally 7 figures per bank to just sit in a room side by side with our scientists to figure out, okay, how are you analyzing this data? What are the techniques that you're using? You're using the latest techniques, the newest techniques. How are you thinking about, how do you define your hypothesis? How do you define your problem statement? How are you moving forward? So we're opening ourselves up with our clients to do that. But of course, in the end, we're always about producing intellectual property for the company moving forward. So here's some of the highlights of the book, Mapping Innovation. So interesting story there. We've been in the Harvard Business Review 3 times in the last 18 months. One of the authors for HBR, his name's Greg Sittel, and he was interviewing me for something he was writing. And he said, I'm writing this book. And there's so many interesting stories about what's happening in these labs. I would love to include some of that in this book. I'm like, well, great, if the PR team's okay with it, I'm certainly okay with it. The book came out about 4 months ago, I think about 4 months ago. And he dedicated almost an entire chapter to Experian DataLabs, and which kind of surprised us, actually. Now this book just hit 2 bestseller lists. It's sold out twice already. So if you haven't read it, not a bad read. What he does is, so he comes on the premise of you have, as you're learning in business school, there are many folks that think they've solved for innovation. And Christensen over at Harvard's got his own way of doing it. And let's just say that Greg's opinion is it really depends on the business that you're in, the industry, and what you're trying to achieve. And depending on what you're trying to achieve, there are different models that you can use. So he calls it mapping innovation, and basically is taking different models and approaching it to different ways to innovate. And he highlights Experian DataLabs as a disruptive innovator for a large company, and we are a way in and of itself that he's mapped. We've grown. We started with one small little group in San Diego. We've got general managers and scientists on 4 continents, including Asia. But we have 3 labs. The 4th one will be announced soon, and you'll hear about that in Singapore. We've just hired the leadership team, and we'll be running there. Revenue. So I started by saying this is not a P&L. There are people here from Experian that know this is not a P&L. The lab is not a P&L. We could be, but we're not. We're about building new products. Businesses take these products to market. We'll take it to a beta client. Maybe sometimes 2 or 3 successful betas. I think with the Analytics Sandbox, we had 12 clients before we moved that over. I don't like that. Then we become all of a sudden a production shop. We're like a business. But you prove out the model, and you move it to the business, and they scale it. We've done that 16 times. 16 times where we've had a product generate $1 million or more in revenue. It's not bad. I think we can be a lot better than that, and we are. These things are growing, but we're aiming bigger. So interesting, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I'll give you an example. So when in an environment like this, we're a bit like an accelerator. And for some of you, I mentor over at Mucker Labs, so I talk with CEOs of startups all the time, and we're kind of like that. We have a lot of startups that are going at any given point. We have, just to give you some metrics that we use, we over the last 3 years have anywhere from 600 to 800 client meetings a year. 600 to 800 client meetings a year. Out of those meetings, we have anywhere from 120 to 160 projects that we can evaluate. It's turned into proposals, they turn into whiteboards. Now, this isn't a big team. Even by what I just said, it's growing, but it's still not that big. That's a lot of work just to do that. Could you imagine if I required everybody to fill out a full business case for every one of those opportunities? I'm sure you did a lot of work in graduate school here. What makes a good business case? And my bet is that when you created one in class, you probably had a long time to do it. And it was probably very thorough. You gave a lot of critical thinking about defining your market and what was addressable, and then financials and the costs, and when are you going to break even. I don't do any of that. This is very radical because in Experian, these guys know, we do a lot of that. But when you have so many opportunities, I focus on two things: magnitude of impact and ability to execute. I don't care if it's a little single. Those bug me. You know, other people can work on the singles. That's not what this is about. We're trying to hit the ball over the fence. Maybe a double is okay, but I don't want singles. Meaning, you know, if it's $2 million, $3 million, $5 million a year in revenue, I'm not going to work on it. So we get in a room and we talk about how big can this market be, and if we can't get past a few $1 million, that's going to kick it out right away. The other one's ability to execute. I don't like swinging at windmills. You know, it's there are a lot of folks that I counsel in startups. They started up, and you know, especially in the beginning, they really struggle with that tangible execution of what their idea is all about. That's why if you go to Mucker, you'll see Will focus on building a prototype, something that you can actively take, because if you can see it, you can touch it, you can pitch it. It's much more real. So I don't require us to prototype things to decide whether or not we're going to do it, but I do want to have a thought process of how does this become real? What are the things we need to do? What's the data that we need to analyze? What's our hypothesis on what we'll find out of that data? Do we have any precedence at all that supports that idea? If not, okay, it might be a risk. Let's keep going with it. How many clients do we think would want to buy this? If we deliver it to one client, how would it get delivered? I know there are a lot of different ways. Just give me one way that we can deliver this that we feel confident of. One way. Could be really hard, but, and so those two things become you can have whiteboard conversations around these two things. And believe it or not, out of those 120 to 160 opportunities per year, that weeds down really fast. And we get to somewhere between 25 to 40 projects a year that we actively work on in the labs. And of those, we hit about 4 products into the market. So that's how that funnel goes. And you can see that it requires a lot of interaction in the market. To get to those 4 products, it started with 600 to 800 client meetings a year. Clients, we have to be meeting with clients. If we stop, we will dry up. That is the fuel for our innovation. And the numbers are good. So actually, up until this past year, we were running at a CAGR of 63%. In this last year, we jumped over 115%, and we continue to forecast similar type growth. So we're doing the right kinds of things. These are the kinds of numbers one would expect to see out of something like that for a company of our size. Just because you expect it doesn't make it easy, but we're in the right direction. So these are some of the products. It's a wide portfolio, and I say that because these things are all over the place. So, for example, and the analytics sandbox was so one of our pitches early on, because we're trying to get our clients' data in, was the idea. So you guys haven't heard this. Private transaction bureau or credit bureau. We know that there's a lot of value behaviorally in that, all the transaction data that's running through credit card, debit card, ATM, checking account. You know, the more I get my hands on that data, the more I'll understand behaviors around risk and interest and all sorts of things. So what if we go to our clients and we say, you know, let us be basically your bureau for all of your data sets. You provide it to us. We're going to overlay it with all these great insights, merge it with our data, and we're going to come back and we'll be able to give you decisions on all different kinds of things. That's like one of those, it's almost a windmill, because you got to convince a big, giant bank that it's in their best interest to basically shift all of their data over to you and start to work on it. That's hard. That's really hard. No matter how good your pitch is, no matter how many great things you have to tell them about it, I'm going to tell you, it's hard. And I know because I've met with the biggest banks in the United States with that pitch and came really close a few times and didn't get it. So we kind of went back and we're kind of sad about that. It's like you put a lot of time and effort. I mean, I've got beautiful decks and all sorts of things that we poured tons of effort into and failed. And then one person in one of our business units said, you really need to go so big on your idea? I mean, really, in the end, what if we just boiled it down a bit, made it a little less complex, and we just used the credit data that we've got? And they just use their data that they would want to merge with our credit data, and then we put some good tools on top of it. What if we just started with that? Where the lab guys are like, well, yeah, but it's not really cool or anything. It's not, not a big deal. And so that one guy out of the business unit said, let me go talk to American Express. I'll talk to American Express. What do you guys think about the idea? And Amex was like, whoa, that idea? Love it. So the guy comes back to lab and he says, hey, remember that idea? He goes, I listened to your idea. You know my idea? I already got a buyer for it. Like that. The problem is we don't know how to build it because it's still a lot of data and it's a lot of decisioning. And so the guys in the lab said, we'll build it. And we built the first multi-tenant Hadoop cluster in our company, which is now a multi-tenant Spark cluster, which is now Ascend, which is now a platform that we're using across the enterprise. But we wound up not only getting American Express, but 11 other clients onto that platform we built in the lab. That platform wound up having a couple hundred nodes and about 1.5 petabytes of data storage, and 3 guys built that over a period of about 4 months. One of the guys didn't even go to college. He dropped out freshman year. We hired him because somebody knew of him because he had built a Hadoop cluster in his garage. We thought, that's the kind of guy we want in the lab. I don't care if he has a PhD or not. He knows what he's doing. Bring him in. And so he and 2 other guys wound up building that thing over nights and weekends. The business invested about $1.5 million in equipment. We built it out, and it's generating 8 figures today. And it's growing. It's one of the fastest growing products we have. So that really wasn't something we had set out to do, but that was kind of how it morphed into it. I'll hit another one, which is balance transfer models. So that one, remember I told you we had one client like in 6 weeks. For 6 weeks of the lab, they gave us like 15 billion transactions. So they gave us some crazy thing to go look at, and honestly, I just can't even remember what it was. But we were so desperate to try to prove that we have value. The first client in the gate, and we said, yeah, whatever you want. But in the process of trying to give them what they wanted, we started noticing that they were really heavy in this balance transfer marketing type campaigns, how they like to acquire their customers. And we're like, we're sitting on top of knowledge for every balance transfer in the country. What are we doing with it? I mean, we know when somebody, all of a sudden the balance goes from one account and shows up in another account. Company's never made any attributes around it. Company's never made any predictive models around it. Company hasn't determined whether or not you have the propensity to balance transfer, how much that balance transfer might be, what time you might do it. All those things we just really never, the balance transfer industry is pretty big. Well, you guys, they dominate that space. So we're like, but with this data, we have all the tags. For the modelers in the room, tags are a big deal. We know what the outcomes are. So we can determine whether or not how accurate our models are going to be as we build them. So we wound up building these models for BT, and people started buying them. Had nothing to do with the project we were working on. That actually turned out to be the third project that we third moneymaker out of the gate. Let's see. Neural embedding for card transaction fraud. Is anybody familiar with neural embedding? Any machine learning guys in the room? Okay, so let me tell you something. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a lab guy, because I'm not really a lab guy. My undergrad's in finance. Yeah, I just tap into like technology and I get excited about this stuff. And but I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. But in this day and age, it's worth your time to understand where technology is going. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, worth the time to investigate. If for those of you that are a little bit technical, there's a great Coursera class out there taught by Andrew Ng at Stanford. You're nodding your head, so I'm thinking you've taken it? You've looked at it? Yeah. It's an excellent class. It's kind of like a beginner's class for machine learning. You don't have to do the homework assignments. It's Coursera. Let's just listen to the lectures. I'm telling you, do yourself a favor, because I actually come from a belief that business people have to have this lingo going forward. So when I talk about unsupervised or supervised machine learning, when we talk about tags, we talk about predictive modeling, if I talk about using LDA for clustering, if I talk about neural networks, you should be tracking with what I'm saying. And just it's a little bit of advice. I know it's unsolicited, but I tell my own kids the same thing. It's just, this is where the world is headed. It's already there in a lot of places. And the other executives at Experian hear me say this too. That's why they love me so much. So neural embedding. True story. I was with one of the other top 4 payment brands in the world and was talking to him about, there's a guy who ran fraud for the globe. And I said, you know, you really should be doing work with the lab. We got the best guys in the world out of this lab. So I have the best guys in the world working at my company. Why do I need you? I said, well, you know, if you don't take my word for it, give me your data. We'll show you. I don't want to give you my data. You know, that means, you know how much hassle it is for me to give you my data. And this is nothing. What are you going to do that's interesting for me? So my guys can detect fraud on your card transaction data better than you can. I really doubt that. I doubt you can do that. He goes, can you do it without tags? Sure, I can do it without tags. Now, what did I just say? Basically, he said, I'm going to give you all my card transaction data. Your job's going to be able to figure out where the fraud came from, and I'm not going to give you any information on where the fraud came from. Go for it. So I came back home, and I said, this guy is willing to give us billions and billions of card transactions, and our job is going to be to figure out where the fraud is. And my team went, yeah, this is great. It's going to be so much fun. And I said, only one little catch is we're going to have to go unsupervised on this one. No tags. Not going to know any of the outcome. And they thought I was absolutely nuts. They wanted to kill me. I was going to have a total mutiny from the scientists. And so the data came in, and I said, look, this is just going to force us to think about this differently. These guys that we're working with, they have all the tags. They know where the fraud is. Problem is, that's their crutch. They are using that to define all of their thinking. We should be able to think differently because we don't have that. So how would we figure out where the fraud is if we don't have the outcomes? Changed our whole mindset. Spent 3 months focused on developing new attributes, doing unsupervised machine learning, trying to detect anomalies, tested it out with our client, and they came back and they said, how in the hell did you do that? You found fraud that we can't find ourselves. In fact, if we use your scoring system, we reduce our false positives by about 70%. That means all the times you said there was fraud and it turned out not to be fraud, about 70% of the time we'd eliminate it. Turns out our approach did something that they would never have thought to do. So think about this. I live in Manhattan and I travel once in a while, but the people around me in Manhattan, they travel a lot. Manhattan's a pretty cosmopolitan, fast-paced environment. It's not unusual for somebody who lives in Manhattan to fly to London or fly to Madrid or Sydney, or, they're world travelers. Manhattan's, up-and-coming place. But Brittany, on the other hand, she lives in the Bronx. Brittany Sorry, I should have said you Manhattan and me in the Bronx. That would have been the polite thing to do. But you have thick skin. You're from the Anderson, no problem, right? So Brittany's from the Bronx. Brittany, she's going to go travel, but nobody around her travels. The neural net models today doesn't really take that into consideration. The neural net models today looks at Brittany and me individually, looks at our profile. If all of a sudden we do something unusual for ourselves, it flags it. This is really weird. Brittany never travels to London, and all of a sudden she did. Eric never travels to London, all of a sudden he did. And you're going to get a phone call, they're going to decline your card or whatever, you're going to have to settle that between you and the bank. Our model didn't look at it that way. It's like birds of a feather. Brittany may, let's say in my case, Eric may never have flown to London, but everybody around him does, so when he does, it's okay, it's normal. When Brittany does, that's unusual. We're going to flag her. Just that unsupervised way of doing it, letting the model cluster around those like characters, all of a sudden became something that was interesting. They couldn't figure out how we were able to do that without knowing or thinking through. The problem is not, now that I've told you, you're like, now I know the secret. I can do this, right? Not really. World's a big place. Those little micro neighborhoods, like I can tell you right now, I live in Encinitas, and in my neighborhood is very different than the neighborhood just down the street. So all of a sudden it gets complicated because there's thousands of those neighborhoods. And how do you know how I'm going to profile all these neighborhoods? So there's not a lot of calculations, amount of thinking. Just because you know the secret, you got to come up with a way to do it automatically. And it changes all the time. So that one was a big win for us, and now banks are lining up because they're all like, hey, well, if you can do it for them, can you do it for us? Yeah, we can. We sit up on top of a lot of data. One of the things that I find super annoying is when I have to fill out a form, especially because in this day and age, in the 21st century, you would think we wouldn't have to fill out forms anymore. I mean, it's just like a relic of the past, yet we continue to have to fill out forms. I can't tell you how many forms I fill out a year. A lot. It's the same data over and over again. At Experian, we pretty much know all that data anyway. We sit on top of it. The challenge is it's not our data. We can't just go and say, hey, we're going to make your life easier, Jose's life easier, and we're just going to fill out the form for you. You have to say it's okay. You have to say it's okay for us to use your data to do that. So we came up with this really easy mechanism that leverages the data in our business, creates an API that our clients can use, that includes the ability for the consumer to say, yes, please use it, or no, thank you, I'll fill it out myself. It's in a safe and secure way. It makes the authentication process easy. And I'll give you an example. The average credit card application today, I think the numbers are behind me, are 22 fields. We can do 16 of them. We can populate 16 of them. So make your life a lot easier. Now you're only populating 6 fields instead of 22. That's something that makes life a little bit more convenient. So ability to execute, that's a 10 out of 10. If you're an engineer, you don't even think that's hard. The hard part really is how smart we are at taking as little information from you as possible and feeling secure and doing an exact match against the data that we have in the background. That's where the magic is in that, but otherwise it's not that complicated to think through. So if it's easy to execute, we think we're confident. What's the impact? How many forms a year do people fill out? Now, it's just simple math. Like you guys are all going to have your MBAs pretty soon. Let me just, I don't know, set you up, but what would be a way you would measure the market potential on something like this?
Look at the conversion rate of a form that has 22 fields versus 6 fields.
That's a really good way. Yeah. Any other ways? That's a good way. Any other ways? Any ways that, if you think about funnels today and people filling out applications, what's a dropout rate? When I'm hot on something, I want it, I get to the form, I'm faced with 22 fields. What's the dropout rate? It's going to be different across markets, across applications, et cetera. But I guarantee you there is a dropout rate. It's similar to what you just said. If I go from 22 to 6, I bet you that's going to change. There's money there. So what's the magnitude of impact? Yeah, it's pretty good because I can tell you, in the lead business, if you can, all of a sudden those great leads that come through and you just create, had more drop to the bottom, that's going to be real money. So anyway, it's just these are the kinds of things that we do in our labs, and they're all across the board. And I could go through each one of these, but literally take all day to go through all of them. Let's talk a little bit about the future. Voice. I'm curious more for myself. How many of you guys think voice is going to be big? Okay, I'm with you, the guys that raise your hand. I'm with you. It's not big yet. But I'm a big believer if somebody else is going to build a railroad, you should seriously take a look at whether it's valuable to ride. And Google and Amazon and Apple are all building a railroad for us. I mean, it's funny because, I have like 4 of these Echoes in my house. And I was thinking to myself, if I would actually, how much I would pay somebody to build an infrastructure in my house where it's voice enabled. And then I was thinking to myself, yeah, but if you flipped it and said, I'm Amazon or Experian or whatever, how much would I pay somebody to allow me to put a voice enabled infrastructure into their house? Because I can make a lot of money once that's in place. So it's one of these things where the infrastructure is growing around us. The value propositions are pretty straightforward. I think, my opinion, I could be crazy, but I think keyboards are hugely inefficient, and I think over time they're just going to go away. And maybe because I've grown up with keyboards, and with some of you, I took typing classes. I don't even know if my kids took typing classes. I mean, it's easy for them, but I'm telling you, it's slow. No matter how fast they can type, and they can out-type me, it's still slow. I can speak faster than they can type. I can speak at about 120 words per minute. They can type, if they're really fast, 60 words per minute. So right out of the gate, it's inefficient. I can tell you that. So I do believe in this. So voice for credit, that's one thing. We actually have already built a prototype in the lab, and it works. You can go to our labs. Our clients can come to our labs. We can demonstrate it. But the world's not ready for it yet. The infrastructure is not complete. I think we got about another 3 years to go before we start hitting critical mass in the US in terms of voice devices in people's homes. And the notion of truly executing in commerce via voice in the privacy of your home, it's going to take it's going to take a while to grow. But just like everything else, it will happen. And so we want to be there. Our belief is you got to work on this now, because in 3 years from now, when the ecosystem changes, the competitive landscape gets shaken up, if we're not there, we're not going to be there at all. This is not a game you want to be late to, and so we're on top of it. So speaking of that, I'm going to finish up with trends, and then we'll go into Q&A. And if you want to debate any of this, I'm totally open to it. Cybersecurity and zero. So the first two, I think, are the absolute 2 hottest trends that I see in the market today. I think cybersecurity and the threat of cyber attack is the #1 item on almost every board of directors list around the country and around the world. If you are thinking about a startup in cybersecurity, you're probably going to get a lot of interest if your idea is novel, and you can execute on it. But it's big. And there's no sign of it changing anytime soon. If you're familiar with zero-knowledge proofs, some of you, if you're not, read up on it, just so you know. No matter what you're doing, if you're going to be a CEO of your own company, make sure the guy that's working for you knows what this is about. Zero-knowledge proofs is the notion that I can share data with anybody else. They don't know anything about me, and I don't know anything about them. It's anonymous sharing. Data is all fully encrypted, all times. And there's a lot of things floating around out there that have the promise of solving for the zero-knowledge proof. Homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation. These are things that, I would say are the cutting edge of this, sharing of data without really sharing data. As a data aggregation business, we need to be sensitive to that. But in an environment of data and analytics, this is going to continue to redefine the way things work. Imagine being the first cloud provider that can make the promise of homomorphic encryption, where data is encrypted even when you're running it through models. This is one of those things that could change the landscape. And it's hot, lots of attention. The other thing, data science, AI talent. You want to add value to your resume. say you know something about artificial intelligence or data science, because I'm telling you right now, it is hot, 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 hot. We compete constantly for talent in this space. And I was sharing with some of you out in the social hour, I was down in Sao Paulo. We just opened up our, great new facilities for our lab. And I had time with one of the 2 largest banks in Sao Paulo, serious player in Sao Paulo. Spent 30 minutes talking about recruiting because they can't recruit the talent. They can't understand how come we are. They're like, what are your secrets? We kind of laid that out. For 30 minutes, we talked about our strategy around recruiting. Let them know. I'm not worried about telling them because they can't compete. It's hard. You got to have a great value proposition. If you're doing a startup, you got to have a great value proposition. You want the best people, you got to attract the talent. And that's the talent is scarce because the demand is so high. It's one of these supply-demand imbalances. It's been like this for 5 years, and everything I'm reading, learning, talking to others, it's going to be like this for at least another 5 years. The schools just aren't catching up fast enough, and it's not that they're not trying, because I know they are. It's just a matter of the demand is so great. That's where the world's headed. So that's hot. The next tier, I'd say, is less hot. Those things are piping hot. The next tier, not so much. All things identity. Identity is whether it's Apple and their new machines and facial recognition and tokenizing identity, to the battle on the marketing side and bridging online and offline data and trying to pull that together, and the role of identity playing in that, around the creation and continued creation of identities that have never existed before, synthetic identities, fraudulent identities. It is a wide spread. Here's something I would submit to you. If you're in the consumer or small business space, and you have any service that touches consumers or small businesses, try delivering your service without having to do anything with identity. You can't. It's a requirement. It's at the cornerstone of everything that we do when it comes to respect to commerce, and 10 times that when you just think digital. Maybe if you go in a store and I pay with cash, you don't need to know anything about me. That's fine. But that in the digital world, it is paramount. So hot, hot, hot. Anything around identity. We could talk a lot about that. You have questions for me about that when we talk about it. The next one is it's been a challenge forever, but it continues to be. And I say forever because the channels keep growing. The data streams come in. They don't all play nicely together. When we could have a philosophical discussion around the world of batch and real time and how that changes over time. But I can tell you that there has never been more pressure at this time to make decisions in real time than ever before. And so while you're trying to maybe make your most complicated decisions in batch and use it in real time, if you're in an environment where you have multiple data streams you're trying to consider, and you're trying to link these together, and then you're trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do in this moment? How am I going to react to this customer? Am I going to sell them something? Do I need to manage a risk that I didn't think I needed to manage? I can't sell them more than one thing, so which ones are going to most likely respond to? I mean, all these things. This is still a challenge. It was a challenge 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's even more a challenge today. Technically, it's a challenge. The hot markets for us right now, so I'm giving you from our perspective, healthcare is hot, massive change in that industry. Insurance, hotter now than it's been in the past. I've never been a big insurance fan. We could talk about property and casualty insurance. I spent a bit of time there, but right now it's going through a disruptive wave, which is interesting. And then financial services is still reeling from fintech. And fintech has just completely taken it, I'd say, kind of put it on its heels. Some of the banks are reacting in the U.S. better than others. Outside the U.S., they're still reacting considerably. So financial services is still in I'd say, a mode of change. Mobile is still hot. I mean, it's not as hot as it was maybe a couple years ago, but it is kind of the champion channel right now in the digital space. You can argue with me on that, that's fine. But very rarely can I tell you in those hundreds of client meetings do we spend a lot of time talking about web. It's almost all about mobile, not at all about voice. I can tell we started having those conversations around voice, and the clients look at us like we have two heads right now. That is just not where it's at. Augmented and virtual reality, again, we're the lab guys. We like to geek out on this stuff, but you go talk about augmented reality, and most of our clients, the retailers, yeah, that's interesting to us, but they're not going into it like you'd expect. That's not to say it won't be hot at some point. It's just we're not getting that kind of traction. We're out trying to talk about it. So I'm just giving you that insight. And blockchain's evolving. I've been with blockchain, I'd say, for the last couple of years. It is evolving. But I still, at least in our circle, you guys might have better examples. I have talked a bit with some of the guys that are out there doing it today, but it's still looking for the big win. And I feel badly for the guys like IBM and EY and these guys that have just poured gobs of money into this space, trying to make this a big win for them. I still think they're searching for the retraction that they believe is going to be there. So I only say that because I know blockchain's big in the schools too. So every time I talk at the university, it comes up. So just thought I'd say that's our perspective. So that's it. Okay.
If those sort of ideas are coming from clients, I assume you guys own the IP and you're able to commercialize these products to other clients. How does that work? What is that relationship like with the clients?
So here's the good news is our clients were begging us to come up with new products. We had gone through this period of time where our clients felt like they had given us the keys to the kingdom and we weren't delivering on a bigger picture over time. So, because I only say that up front because one could think if I was a client and I was talking with a company like Experian and we engaged in this conversation, that I might get a little upset that all of a sudden Experian goes off and builds the product and I'm like, hey, I just gave them this golden idea and they were going to make all this money on it. What do I get out of it? I get nothing. It's not like that at all. Our clients are actually actively looking to us to build things. So like form fill, we engaged in that because we had another product that we had brought to market called Text for Credit. It's a long story, I can go into it, but we basically it's easy to get a credit application, be pre-qualified on your mobile device without downloading an app or anything. You just text in and we pre-qualify you. And so the next process in that was filling out a credit application on mobile phone, and that's lousy. So we had about 8 clients actively ask us, can you come up with a solution to allow for that application to be filled out because we think our funnel will improve. So that was, we had 70 client meetings around Text for Credit. And of those 70, we had 8 that straight up asked us for form fill, and if you build it, kind of like my earlier thing about the P&L, we'd love to buy it from you. So that was enough for us to go and build that. Some of them are much more intricate. We had one client that was under a consent decree to fulfill on authenticating small businesses during the lending process, and they were struggling with authenticating about 30% of the applications that were coming in their door. So in that way, we worked very tightly with that bank for about a 6-month period of time to get a solution into the market. But the understanding was we own the intellectual property, so once we got them up and running, we started getting other banks up and running. I could negotiate and sign deals where if I'm really worried about IP, like because the bank or retailer or mobile network operator we're working with is concerned about the IP and its value to them and they want a competitive distinction, that we could give them some kind of runway zone. Hey, for the first 6 months, you're the only guy in the market that can have that. I try to avoid those in general, mostly because we talk about the reputation factor internally. I cut that deal with one client. I have a whole sales team that now hates me. And so, the last thing I want is that because I'm constantly trying to make sure the sales guys love what we're doing and want to help us and be out in the market and all those things. So I try to avoid that. So it's a great question. So the question is basically, how do we manage the process of going from a beta client to a full production process with our business unit colleagues? And I probably get more agita over that than anything else in my job. Actually, I never lose sleep about building something new. I got a great team. If they tell a client we're going to have it done in 12 weeks or 8 weeks, I never lose sleep over that because they deliver. But all of a sudden, I build something that the company has never used before. And now I have to figure out a way to get it into the business unit. It's been a long cycle. There's never been an easy process. I would say, so what we wound up doing, it was an evolutionary curve. It started with I built something and our business colleagues would say, give it to me right away. And they'd take it and they'd run with it and it would blow up. And then they would get upset and say, why did you give me this and it doesn't work? I was like, no, it works fine. You just didn't do it right. It's a terrible process. So then, that's one side. Then it flipped the whole other way. And I said, I'll keep it until this is generating a bunch of revenue. And then we'll give it to you kind of lock, stock, and barrel. And you don't have to do a thing. You just manage it from there. That's what we did with the Analytics Sandbox. We did with business verification. And basically in that stage, we are production. I got guys wearing pagers. Something blows up in the middle of, all of a sudden you got 50 analysts on India on our platform and they're tearing it apart and something blows up. Then we've got 3 scientists in the lab on Sunday night trying to figure out how to fix it. That sucks because, guys who do R&D, that's the last thing that they want to do. But we did that for a while. So we went from being an accelerator to an incubator. And, and I started saying, we're an incubator. This is what we do. Guys weren't happy. The business units started getting nervous, right? So all of a sudden, it's like one more group that needs to go through really severe audits. I mean, R&D, we go through audits. But being an R&D in production, I actually had audit coming in before we even launched, just so they could make sure that we're not missing anything that they're going to come up with later, because these guys don't have the experience to be able to know what's going to come up. So that didn't work, but we did that for about 3 years. And now we're at a new stage. So what we did is we decided we were going to build a team that sits between the lab and the business units. And their job is to try to be kind of the front runners on everything that's happening. Things that are coming out of the business units and they want to move to the labs, things that are coming out of labs and moving to the business units, the whole, we'll say, care and feeding process of moving something that's in beta into a production environment in the business unit. They drive that. And we just started that about 7 months ago. And we've had 2 product launches, and they've been the smoothest, I won't say they're smooth, the smoothest launches we've had since we've started the lab. So it's a step in the right direction. But it's hard. That's really hard. It's like trying to get, it's like if you think about this, I used to do M&A work. That was my job way back when. And when you buy a company, you integrate it. You run into a gazillion issues, and most of which you never would anticipate. And that's, most acquisitions are always bumpy. A lot of them fail when it comes time to integrate. And it's kind of like we're doing that on every single product. So we need to get out of that mode. And so the last 6 months, I'd say, is the closest we've done to getting out of that mode, but we still have work to do. It's not something that gets an A at all. So the question is, if I don't look at P&L, how do I evaluate projects against each other, because there are different metrics to measure those projects? And only a small little correction, and if I miscommunicated, I'm sorry. It's not that I don't look at P&L. I am not held accountable for a P&L, and there is a difference. So, and what I mean by that is the company does not put a revenue goal on the labs, on any of our labs, at any time. So typically, maybe I'll say this and you guys already understand, so forgive me if you already know what I'm going to say. But typically, every year when you have a P&L goal, you're held accountable to hit that revenue, and then that drives how much revenue you're going to need to hit the following year and the following year after that. So if our lab products are going to generate $40 million, over the course of a year, typically the way we would think is, okay, next year you're going to have to drive 46 million or 50 million. So where does that pressure or responsibility lie? If they put it on me, then when I'm evaluating projects, I just basically defaulted back to the problem I had before I even started, which is I'm going to go, okay, well, how can I generate $10 more million in incremental revenue over the next 12 months? And so what did you wind up? You start taking on projects with less risk, more certainty of outcome, and so you've just created the problem you tried to avoid. So we don't do that. But we do have to be sensitive to how much money these projects make, because in the end, hey, lab not doing a great job if it doesn't build anything that's generating money. So you asked a good question, how do I get measured? And the good thing is I work for the global chief operating officer of the company. If I probably didn't work for somebody so understanding, he's not understanding with everybody else, he's very understanding with me. We had a gentleman's agreement when I started the lab. And he hired me into the company, and when we started the lab, he said, if you and I can agree that we'll know if it's working and we'll know if it's not working. That's very vague. GE would never go for that. It's very vague. I had to be comfortable with that, and he had to be comfortable with that. As long as the two of us were, everybody else who was uncomfortable with that didn't matter. Because everybody reports to my boss. So every regional CEO reports to the guy I report to. So even if they were upset by it, in the end, he gets the final say. The only guy that could overrule that is our global CEO, and he's on board, so that's good. And we've maintained that since we started. So, I showed you some metrics up there about how things are going. He's thrilled. It's working. But he's not going to tell me, okay, Eric, next year I need you to hit this revenue number. My colleagues in the business units, they have the targets. I don't have the targets. And they don't have the oversight to tell me, Eric, you need to work on this project here because I need this done to hit this revenue target. That's why I report to the guy I report to. So they can't do that. So we've tried to architect, there's no right answer on this, but we tried to architect an environment that allows us to continue to innovate no matter what climate we run into in a financials perspective from year to year to year. All of a sudden we hit a bumpy road, the economy goes south, and everybody's scrambling to hit our EBIT number. That typically means cutting costs. Where do you cut costs? Well, a great place to cut costs is R&D, right? It's got no impact at all to the bottom line. You cut these guys, you'll never miss them for the next 12 months. So that's why we did what we did. We pulled it out, we set it to the side. And you might say, I got a great job because, I don't have to worry about these things. But believe me, there's a lot of accountability outside of that with my colleagues. So every time they give me money, they remind me of the fact that they're making this bet on the lab, and if I don't deliver, they may not feel it this year, but they're going to feel it next year, and that's when I'll feel it. So, but it's worked out just fine. Thank you. Thank you.